Hi, I'm Adam Jaffe. I'm the director and a senior fellow at Motu, Economic and Public Policy Research in Wellington, New Zealand. Motu is a not-for-profit research institute that looks at various issues of economics and public policy with a particular orientation to doing analysis of what is the evidence on important public policy issues, mostly in New Zealand, but also to some extent internationally. I'm an economist. I've been at Motu for about 2.5 years, but I've spent pretty much my whole career in one way or another looking at the economics of innovation and the economics of research and science, and how scientific research and technological innovation, where do they come from and what impacts do they have on the economy and on society, mostly using statistical and economic techniques to do that analysis. Innovation, broadly defined as people doing things that really hadn't been done before, is very important in the long run for improving our well-being, whether you think of that in narrow economic terms or in broader social terms. If we want to be able to solve problems that we can't solve today and achieve things that we can't achieve today, it's going to require doing things we don't know how to do today. If we look at the historical evidence, a significant amount of innovation historically has been related to research and to advancing human knowledge through science, again, broadly defined, and research. So these are human activities that have very large benefits, and they come from many different places. Firms invest in innovation, individuals do innovative things just because they're driven to do it, but the evidence is pretty compelling that when governments acting through public programs invest in research and invest in innovation, they can, doesn't always work, but they can accelerate these processes. And most of the governments in the world, in so-called advanced economies and even increasingly in middle-income economies, invest some of their taxpayers' dollars in trying to foster research and in trying to spur innovation. And as I explained in the lecture I gave today, these programs theoretically are well justified. Those are activities which we know can be productive, but we don't know that they are always productive. And in fact, we suspect that they're probably not always productive, that some of those programs are more effective than others. And these are significant public investments, and there's a lot at stake. So it would be good if we knew more about which programs work best. And what I've been working on really for the last 15 or 20 years, first in the United States and more recently in New Zealand, is trying to develop methods and then encourage governments to use the methods for this more systematic and careful evaluation of these programs so that we can know which ones work best. In doing this kind of analysis, in trying to determine which of these programs is most effective, the biggest sort of empirical or statistical challenge is we need to look at what happened after, say, the government funded some people to do research, and we need to have a way of measuring what was the magnitude of the government's impact on that activity. So, for example, many governments in the world fund scientific research, and they do it in various different ways, but roughly speaking, many of these programs operate by government panels or panels of scientists try to figure out which research is most promising, and then they award funding to these research groups to do research. And the question that we'd like to be able to analyze is, do the groups that get this funding, are they more likely to succeed, and do they go farther with their research than if they had not gotten the funding? And the challenge in doing that is the very fact that the government is trying in the first instance to fund the most promising research. So the fact that the people who were funded were successful doesn't really prove very much. So what I was able to do in New Zealand, because the organization that runs this program in New Zealand wanted to do this kind of evaluation, is I was able to get access to data on the groups that had applied for research grants. And I have information on both the groups that were funded and the groups that weren't funded. And I also know what were the scores that were given to each of these proposals by the funding agency in the process of choosing which ones to fund. So what that allows me to do is I come along after the fact and I look at the publications and the citations to these publications, which is an indicator of their which is an indicator of their scientific impact. And I can look and see this scientist applied for a grant, got this many papers, they had this many citations. That scientist had a certain rate of publication and citation before he even applied for the grant. Was it increased? And was it increased more for the people who were funded than the people who weren't funded? And I can statistically control for the selection process using the scores that were assigned during the process. And when we did this in New Zealand, what we found was that the funding was effective in increasing the output of the researchers. The funded researchers published more papers, and the papers they did publish were more highly cited than you would have expected based on their previous publication. And they published more than the researchers that were not funded. The interesting result of the research, which we had not anticipated going into it, was there actually was not a selection bias in the sense that the proposals that the agency had rated as more promising in the review process were not on average more successful than the ones that they rated as less promising. Now it's important in thinking about that result that the particular program that we're looking at is a two-stage process where the Royal Society of New Zealand reviewers begin by rejecting a large fraction of proposals. More than half the proposals are rejected sort of off the bat, and then it's only 20 to 40% of what they think are the best proposals that are even considered in the second round. So one way to think about this is once you've already gotten to the 20 or 40% of the best proposals, it's really very hard to discriminate among them and to determine which are really the best. And the evidence is that although they were trying to do that, they actually were not successfully discriminating among that 20 to 40% of the best proposals. So, you know, when you're doing this kind of research, one of the challenges that you face is frequently scientists and scientific agencies will say, well, why do we need to do this kind of research? We know that if we give scientists more resources, they will be able to do more research and they'll get more out of it. And as an economist, my response to that is, well, you may think you know that, but empirically, I'd still like to know, is it really true? And how significant is that effect? Certainly, for certain kinds of science, if you have absolutely no resources, if you have no one working for you and you don't have a laboratory, you cannot do anything. But it doesn't follow from that if I take a good scientist who already has some resources and I give them more, that they're going to get more than they would have otherwise gotten. So that was what we wanted to test. So another way to think about this problem of how do we know how effective these government programs are is to think of them in the way we think about a new drug. So someone's come up with a new drug or a new medical treatment. We want to know how effective it is. What we do is what is called in technical terms a randomized controlled trial. So we take a set of people for whom the drug might be useful, and we randomly divide them into groups, and some of those groups are given the drug and some are not given the drug. And then the way that we test the effectiveness of the drug is by comparing the outcomes for those who got it and those who didn't. I have actually advocated, to some extent, trying to apply those methods to government research programs. And the government does, many governments do randomized controlled trials in other contexts for certain kinds of programs. There has not been a lot of movement in the funding of research area towards that approach, towards the approach of randomized control trials. It turns out, if you look at it carefully from a statistical perspective, if you have this information that I spoke about a minute ago about the evaluation metrics, whether they're scores or rankings that are applied in choosing who to be funded, that from a statistical perspective, you can use that information to come pretty close to reproducing the same kind of outcome you would get from a randomized controlled trial. It's not exactly the same. The differences are a little technical, so I won't go into it. There's certain kinds of questions you can't quite pin down as well, but it's actually quite close to what you could get from the randomized controlled trial using statistical methods. But the key is you need to have that evaluation score. If you don't have that, you can't do that statistical adjustment. And most agencies have that information, but don't share it. So even once you've addressed, in the ways we've been talking about, the problem of figuring out sort of how much difference did the government make, there are other challenges in really thinking systematically about evaluating these programs. One of them is that if you're interested not just in more science, but in real impact in terms of social and economic improvement, these things take a long time. And not only do they take a long time, we don't even know how long they take in particular cases. Sometimes it might be 5 years, sometimes it might be 20 years. So to try to measure that can be very challenging. There's no perfect answer to that, and you're never going to do an evaluation that is going to sort of capture all of the possible impacts. But I think the key is to use multiple metrics and to be sort of open-minded about the kinds of metrics that might be informative, and to be looking at not just kind of ultimate impacts, but intermediate outcomes as well, which can give you evidence that things are on the right track, even if you don't yet know that you're going to get to where you wanted to go to. So for example, one thing governments do look at is if they've funded research in a certain area, has there been an inflow of private investment following up on the research they've done? Now, sometimes that becomes an end in itself. You know, their goal is to induce private firms to invest, which I think is a little bit off because that's not really the goal. The goal is some economic benefit. But I think one way to look at that is to say that investment by private firms, while it may not be a goal in itself, is an indicator of some intermediate progress towards an objective. And I think it's worth looking at for that reason. Another problem that is very significant in this area is that one of the reasons that we believe governments, that there is value to having governments invest public resources in innovation and research is because it's very risky and the failure rate is very high. And governments can, at least in principle, absorb that kind of risk in the way that a single small company, for example, can't. But that also creates challenges for governments, and the challenges are both sort of statistical and political. I mean, the political challenge is if you're the bureaucrat who approved some program, it can be difficult to say, well, it failed, but we knew that half of the things we were going to fund were going to fail, and that's actually success because we learn from our failures. So there's a political learning that needs to go on so that governments can think this way. And I think the easiest way to sort of make that concrete is, you know, if you sit in a bar in Silicon Valley, the entrepreneurs brag about their failures. They wear them as a badge of honor. And I think we all know that Silicon Valley is what we all want to be like. So if we sort of can get bureaucrats to think about the fact that the entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, which is what we're trying to emulate, really see failure as part of the process, that might help with the political side. There is also a statistical side, which is if you're trying to measure the success of a program, And that success is going to be embedded in a small number of very large successes surrounded by a large number of failures. It just makes the measurement very hard in terms of capturing that. And so again, I think the solution is multiple indicators. Some of those failures you may still be able to point to as, well, we learned things from that. And that failure led to something else which eventually had some value. So I think, again, it doesn't completely solve the problem, but I think if you take the perspective that the consequences of our investment are multifaceted, so that our measurements should be multifaceted, you can make a lot of progress.